I had been content with my solitary existence, finding solace in books and the quiet of my own company. But as time wore on, the silence of my empty house began to weigh on me, pressing against my chest like a physical thing. It was this creeping loneliness that led me to make a decision that would forever alter the course of my life. A decision that still haunts me to this day. It was a crisp autumn morning when I finally worked up the courage to visit the local animal shelter. The air was thick with the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of change. As I walked through the shelter doors, a cacophony of barks and whines greeted me, a stark contrast to the silence I had grown accustomed to. That's when I saw him. A golden retriever with soulful brown eyes that seemed to look right through me. The tag on his kennel read Max. As I approached, he wagged his tail tentatively, as if unsure whether to hope for a new home or brace for disappointment. "This one's been here a while," the shelter worker said, noticing my interest. "He's a bit older, so most people pass him by for the puppies. But he's got a heart of gold." Something in Max's eyes spoke to me, and before I knew it, I was signing adoption papers. The drive home was filled with nervous excitement, both from Max and myself. As we entered my house, I couldn't help but feel like a new chapter of my life was beginning. The first few weeks with Max were nothing short of idyllic. He was everything I could have hoped for in a companion. Gentle, playful, and affectionate. His presence filled the empty spaces in my home and my heart. We fell into a comfortable routine of morning walks, evening cuddles, and lazy weekends spent lounging in the backyard. I marveled at how quickly Max adapted to his new home. He seemed to know instinctively which was his bed, where his food and water bowls belonged, and even which chair was my favorite, so he could lay at my feet while I read. It was as if he had always been a part of my life, filling a void I hadn't even realized existed. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself smiling more, laughing at Max's antics, and feeling a warmth in my chest that I had almost forgotten was possible. For the first time in years, I felt truly content. Little did I know that this perfect companion would soon become the source of my deepest fears and most terrifying nightmares. It was a balmy summer evening when everything changed. The full moon hung low and heavy in the sky, casting an eerie glow through the windows. I had always been a light sleeper, but that night, something pulled me from my slumber with an urgency I couldn't explain. The first thing I noticed was the silence. The usual ambient noises of the night, crickets chirping, the distant hum of traffic, were conspicuously absent. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard it, the slow, deliberate sound of nails scraping against hardwood. My heart leaped into my throat as I sat up, straining my eyes in the darkness. There, in the center of my bedroom, stood Max. But something was terribly wrong. His eyes, usually warm and brown, now glowed with an unnatural red light. They seemed to pulse in the darkness, like twin embers burning with an otherworldly fire. I blinked hard, convinced I must be dreaming, but when I opened my eyes, the horrifying vision remained. Max began to move, circling slowly in the middle of the room. With each rotation, his pace increased, until he was nothing but a golden blur, his glowing eyes leaving trails of red light in the darkness. Suddenly, he stopped, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that froze the breath in my lungs. A low growl emanated from deep within his chest, building in volume and ferocity until it filled the room. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, guttural, primal, and utterly inhuman. This wasn't the playful rumble I was accustomed to hearing during our games of tug-of-war. This was the sound of something ancient and terrifying, something that had no place in my gentle companion. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but sit there paralyzed with fear. But my body refused to obey, held captive by those burning red eyes and that bone-chilling growl. Just as I thought my racing heart might burst from my chest, the spell broke. Max blinked, and in an instant, his eyes returned to their normal warm brown. The growl subsided, replaced by a soft whine as he padded over to my bedside, resting his head on my lap as he had done countless times before. I sat there, trembling, my hand automatically moving to stroke his fur. Had it all been a nightmare? A trick of the light and my own overactive imagination? As the first rays of dawn began to creep through the window, I tried to convince myself that's all it had been. But deep down, I knew something had fundamentally changed. The Max I knew and loved had shown me a glimpse of something else, something that defied explanation. And I feared it was only the beginning. In the days following that unsettling full moon night, I found myself hyper-aware of Max's every move. I watched him closely, searching for any sign of the otherworldly creature I had glimpsed. But Max seemed to have returned to his normal, lovable self. He wagged his tail when I came home, played fetch in the backyard, and curled up at my feet while I worked. I began to wonder if I had imagined the whole terrifying episode. Yet, as the weeks wore on, subtle changes in Max's behavior began to gnaw at the edges of my perception. It started with small things. The way he would sometimes stare intently at empty corners of the room, or how he began to shy away from his favorite squeaky toy. I tried to rationalize these changes, telling myself that all dogs have their quirks. But then the nighttime disturbances began. I'd wake up to the sound of Max pacing restlessly, his nails clicking against the hardwood floors in an irregular rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. When I'd call out to him, he'd appear in my doorway, his silhouette oddly elongated in the dim light, before slinking back into the shadows. During our walks, Max started to pull me towards areas he'd previously avoided: overgrown alleys, abandoned lots, and the old cemetery at the edge of town. His usual playful demeanor would shift, becoming intense and focused, as if he were searching for something just beyond my understanding. The most unsettling change was in his eyes. Though they never again glowed red as they had on that first night, I sometimes caught flashes of something in their depths, a glimmer of awareness that seemed far too intelligent for a dog. In these moments, Max would hold my gaze, and I'd feel a chill run down my spine, as if he were looking into my very soul. As autumn crept in and the days grew shorter, I found myself dreading the approach of night. The darkness seemed to bring out whatever strange force had taken hold of Max. I began to leave lights on throughout the house, as if their artificial glow could keep at bay the growing sense that something fundamental in my world had shifted. Despite my mounting unease, I couldn't bring myself to consider getting rid of Max. He was still my companion, my friend. But with each passing day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the dog I had adopted was slowly being replaced by something else. Something that walked the line between the world I knew and one I couldn't begin to comprehend. It was a stormy night in late October when the true extent of Max's transformation became undeniable. The wind howled outside, rain lashing against the windows, as if nature itself was mirroring the turmoil within my home. I had been working late, my attention focused on my laptop, when a movement in my peripheral vision caught my eye. I looked up, expecting to see Max padding across the room. Instead, I watched in horror as my coffee mug slowly slid across the desk, seemingly of its own accord. It moved with purpose, not the random jostle of an earthquake, until it teetered on the edge and then crashed to the floor. My heart pounding, I spun around, searching for an explanation. That's when I saw Max sitting in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the shattered remains of the mug. As I watched, dumbfounded, other objects in the room began to tremble and shift. Books fell from shelves, chairs scraped across the floor, and my papers swirled in the air as if caught in an invisible whirlwind. In the midst of this impossible scene, Max remained eerily still, the calm eye of a supernatural storm. Then, slowly, he turned his gaze to me. In that moment, I knew with chilling certainty that he was the cause of this poltergeist-like activity. Before I could react, Max threw his head back and began to howl. But this was no ordinary howl. It was a sound that seemed to come from the depths of time itself. The language, if it could be called that, was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was guttural and ancient, filled with syllables that no canine throat should have been able to produce. As Max's unearthly song filled the air, the walls seemed to vibrate, and shadows danced at the corners of my vision. I could almost see shapes forming in the darkness, twisted, otherworldly things that retreated the moment I tried to focus on them. The howling continued, rising and falling in a rhythm that made my head spin. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the sound seemed to penetrate directly into my brain. Fragments of meaning teased at the edges of my comprehension, as if the longer I listened, the closer I came to understanding some terrible, cosmic truth. Just as I felt I might lose my grip on sanity, the howling stopped. The sudden silence was almost as deafening as the otherworldly noise had been. Objects ceased their unnatural movement, clattering to the ground or settling back into place. I looked at Max, my body trembling with fear and adrenaline. He sat there, tail wagging slightly, looking for all the world like a normal dog who had just done something clever and was waiting for praise. But his eyes held a spark of something ancient and knowing, a look that said he was fully aware of what had just transpired. As I sank to the floor, my mind reeling, one thought crystallized through the chaos of my emotions. The dog I had adopted, the companion I had come to love, was far more than he appeared to be. And I was now irrevocably entangled in whatever supernatural drama was unfolding within my home. The weeks following the poltergeist incident were a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. I found myself jumping at every sound, scrutinizing every shadow. Max's behavior continued to oscillate between that of a normal, loving dog and something else. Something that sent shivers down my spine and made me question my sanity. It was on a moonless night in November that I witnessed the most terrifying manifestation of Max's transformation yet. I had finally managed to fall into a fitful sleep, only to be jolted awake by a strange scratching sound coming from downstairs. My heart pounding, I crept out of bed and made my way to the kitchen, drawn by an eerie, flickering light. Nothing could have prepared me for the scene that awaited me. There, in the center of the kitchen floor, stood Max. But he wasn't on all fours as a dog should be. Instead, he was eerily erect on his hind legs, his front paws gripping a large kitchen knife with a dexterity that no canine should possess. The flickering light I had seen was emanating from Max's eyes, casting long, grotesque shadows across the walls. But it was what he was doing that froze the blood in my veins. With precise, deliberate movements, Max was using the knife to carve intricate symbols into the wooden floor. I watched, paralyzed with horror, as line after line appeared, forming a complex pattern that seemed to writhe and shift before my eyes. The symbols were unlike anything I had ever seen. Not quite hieroglyphics, not quite runic, but something far more ancient and sinister. As Max worked, a low humming filled the air, rising and falling in pitch. With a jolt, I realized the sound was coming from Max himself, a chant in that same eldritch language I had heard before. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath misting in the air. Suddenly, Max paused in his carving and slowly turned his head towards me. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw something in his gaze that was both Max and not Max. A swirling vortex of canine loyalty and cosmic awareness that threatened to draw me in and shatter my mind. A whimper escaped my lips, breaking the spell. Max's eyes flickered, and for a brief instant, I saw confusion and what almost looked like remorse in them. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, he dropped back to all fours, the knife clattering to the floor. I stood there, shaking, as Max padded over to me, tail wagging hesitantly. He nuzzled my hand, a gesture so normal, so dog-like, that I almost convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. But the carved symbols on my kitchen floor told a different story. A story of cosmic horrors and ancient rituals that I was only beginning to glimpse. As I sank to the floor, cradling Max's furry head in my lap, I knew I could no longer deny the truth. My beloved pet was a conduit for something far beyond my understanding, and I was trapped in a waking nightmare with no clear way out. The morning after the ritual incident, I called in sick to work. How could I possibly face the mundane world when my reality had been so thoroughly shattered? Instead, I spent the day alternating between staring at the arcane symbols carved into my kitchen floor and watching Max, who was once again the picture of a normal, happy dog. Desperate for answers, I turned to the internet. I spent hours scouring forums and websites, searching for any information on supernatural canine behavior. Most of what I found was clearly fiction or the ramblings of conspiracy theorists. But occasionally, I'd come across a post or a story that resonated with my experiences, sending chills down my spine. One account particularly stood out, a story of a woman whose cat had exhibited similar bizarre behaviors. The tale ended abruptly, with no resolution, leaving me to wonder what had become of the woman and her pet. As my search grew more frantic, I began reaching out to veterinarians and animal behaviorists. I tried to describe Max's symptoms without sounding completely unhinged, speaking vaguely of night terrors and unusual aggressiveness. But their responses were always the same: suggestions of medical tests, questions about changes in diet or routine, and recommendations for animal therapists. I even went so far as to consult a local paranormal investigator, showing him photos of the symbols Max had carved. The man's face had gone pale, and he'd muttered something about elder signs and cosmic entities before hurriedly excusing himself. He never returned my subsequent calls. With each dead end, my frustration and fear grew. I felt increasingly isolated, trapped in a world that had no frame of reference for what I was experiencing. The rational part of my mind tried to insist that there must be a logical explanation. A brain tumor, perhaps, or some rare form of canine dementia. But deep down, I knew that no earthly ailment could account for what I had witnessed. As I watched Max sleeping peacefully in a sunbeam, looking for all the world like an ordinary beloved pet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the precipice of something vast and terrifying. Whatever was happening to Max, whatever he was becoming, was beyond the scope of veterinary medicine or even conventional supernatural lore. I was adrift in uncharted waters, with only my transforming dog as a companion, and the growing certainty that things were going to get much, much worse before I found any answers. The culmination of my fears arrived on a frigid winter night, the kind where the cold seeps into your bones and the darkness feels alive. I had finally succumbed to exhaustion after days of fitful sleep, my dreams plagued by swirling symbols and otherworldly howls. It was the silence that woke me, an oppressive, unnatural quiet that pressed against my eardrums. As I opened my eyes, my heart nearly stopped. There, at the foot of my bed, stood Max. But it wasn't the Max I knew. His form was elongated, almost humanoid, his fur seeming to ripple and shift like smoke. His eyes, those once warm brown eyes, now glowed with an eldritch light that cast long, twisted shadows across the room. As I watched, paralyzed with terror, Max's head slowly turned towards me, rotating far beyond what should have been physically possible for a dog. Our gazes locked, and in that moment, I felt my mind teetering on the edge of an abyss. In Max's eyes, I saw eons of cosmic history, glimpses of realities so alien and vast that my human mind could barely comprehend them. I saw worlds being born and dying, civilizations rising and falling, all in the span of a heartbeat. A low, rumbling sound filled the room, and with horror, I realized it was coming from Max. It wasn't a growl, not really. It was more like the sound of tectonic plates shifting, of stars colliding in the void of space. As the sound grew, objects in my room began to vibrate and lift off surfaces, defying gravity. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but lie there in the grip of this cosmic terror. But my body refused to obey, held captive by whatever force Max was channeling. I could feel my sanity fraying at the edges, my mind struggling to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be possible. Just as I thought I would shatter under the weight of this eldritch revelation, Max blinked. In that instant, the oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the objects in my room clattered back to their places. Max's form shimmered and shrank, until he was once again the golden retriever I had adopted. He padded over to the side of my bed, whining softly and resting his head on the mattress. His eyes, now back to their normal brown, looked up at me with what seemed like a mixture of confusion and remorse. It was such a dog-like gesture, so at odds with the cosmic horror I had just witnessed, that I felt hysteria bubbling up in my chest. With trembling hands, I reached out to touch Max's fur, half expecting my fingers to pass through him like smoke. But he was solid, warm, real. As I stroked his head, my mind raced. What was happening to my dog? What was he becoming? And more importantly, what did it mean for me? As the first light of dawn began to creep through my window, I made a decision. I couldn't go on like this, living in fear and uncertainty. I needed answers, and I needed them now. With shaking fingers, I reached for my phone and dialed the emergency number for my veterinarian. The veterinary clinic was eerily quiet when we arrived, the early morning light casting long shadows across the empty waiting room. Anderson, my regular vet, greeted us with a concerned frown, no doubt noting my disheveled appearance and wild eyes. "What seems to be the problem?" she asked, ushering us into an examination room. I hesitated, unsure how to explain what I had witnessed without sounding completely insane. Finally, I settled for a watered-down version of the truth. Max has been acting strange, aggressive at times, but then back to normal, and there have been incidents at night. Anderson nodded, her face neutral as she began examining Max. He sat patiently, the picture of a well-behaved dog, showing no signs of the otherworldly entity I had seen just hours before. Over the next few hours, Max underwent a battery of tests, blood work, X-rays, even an MRI. With each test, I held my breath, half expecting the machines to short out or for Max to suddenly transform before our eyes. But nothing out of the ordinary happened. As we waited for the results, Dr. Anderson's frown deepened. "I've never seen anything quite like this," she admitted, poring over the charts. "His vitals are normal, no signs of any physical ailments. But these brainwave patterns, they're unlike anything I've ever encountered in a canine." She showed me the EEG readout, pointing to erratic spikes and swirls that meant nothing to me but clearly disturbed her. If I didn't know better, I'd say these were closer to human brainwaves. But even then, there are anomalies I can't explain. In the end, we left the clinic with more questions than answers. Anderson prescribed a regimen of anti-anxiety medication for Max and recommended a specialist in canine neurology. But as we drove home, Max sitting calmly in the back seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only scratched the surface of whatever was happening to my once ordinary pet. The weeks following our visit to the vet passed in an uneasy calm. Max seemed to return to his old self, playful and affectionate during the day. The anti-anxiety medication appeared to be working, or at least that's what I desperately wanted to believe. Gone were the midnight rituals, the levitating objects, and the bone-chilling howls. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that this normalcy was merely a facade, a calm before an even greater storm. I found myself watching Max constantly, scrutinizing his every move for signs of the otherworldly entity I had glimpsed. Was that tail wag a little too knowing? Did his eyes linger a moment too long on that empty corner? I tried to resume some semblance of a normal life. I returned to work, went through the motions of my daily routines, but always with one eye on Max. Our walks became tense affairs, with me constantly on alert for any sign of unusual behavior. Even in sleep, I found no respite, my dreams haunted by swirling symbols and echoes of that cosmic language I had heard Max speak. Friends and family began to notice my changed demeanor. I had become jumpy, prone to startling at sudden noises or movements. Dark circles formed under my eyes from nights spent watching Max sleep, afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes. When asked, I brushed off their concerns with vague excuses about work stress and insomnia. As days turned into weeks without incident, I began to wonder if perhaps it had all been in my head. Could stress and loneliness have caused me to hallucinate those terrifying events? But then I would catch a glimpse of something in Max's eyes, a flicker of that ancient, knowing intelligence, and my doubts would vanish, replaced by a cold dread in the pit of my stomach. It's been months since that last terrifying night, and on the surface, life has returned to normal. Max is, by all appearances, just a regular, loving golden retriever. He greets me enthusiastically when I come home, plays fetch in the backyard, and curls up at my feet while I work. To an outsider, we would look like any other person and their beloved pet. But I know better. The memories of those nightmarish events are etched into my mind, as clear and vivid as the day they happened. I find myself constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Max to reveal once again the cosmic entity that lurks beneath his canine exterior. I've developed a hyper-awareness of the world around me, noticing details and patterns that I would have dismissed before. The way shadows sometimes seem to move of their own accord, the whispers on the wind that sound almost like words in that eldritch language I heard Max speak. Are these real phenomena, or just manifestations of my traumatized psyche? I no longer know where reality ends and paranoia begins. My relationships have suffered. How can I explain to friends or family what I've experienced? Who would believe me? I've become increasingly isolated, my world shrinking to the confines of my home and the enigma that is Max. There are moments, fleeting and rare, when I catch a glimpse of something in Max's eyes, a spark of that vast, cosmic awareness that both terrifies and fascinates me. In these moments, I'm reminded that the creature lying at my feet is both my loyal companion and a conduit for something far beyond human comprehension. I've come to accept that I may never fully understand what happened or what Max truly is. Perhaps he's a guardian, protecting me from cosmic horrors I can't even imagine. Or maybe he's a harbinger of something yet to come, a future where the boundaries between our world and others break down entirely. Whatever the truth may be, I know that my life has been irrevocably changed. I live now in a world where the impossible is possible, where the line between reality and nightmare is blurred. Every day is a balance between love for my faithful companion and fear of what he might become. As I write these words, Max sleeps peacefully nearby, his chest rising and falling with each breath. He looks so normal, so innocent. Yet I know that beneath that furry exterior lies a mystery that defies explanation, a connection to realms and realities beyond our own. Will Max's true nature reveal itself again? Is this period of calm merely a prelude to something even more terrifying? I don't know. But whatever comes, I know that my life is now inextricably linked with this extraordinary being. For better or worse, Max and I are on this journey together, navigating a world that is far stranger and more wondrous than I ever could have imagined. As the sun sets and shadows lengthen across the room, I reach out to stroke Max's fur. He opens his eyes, warm and brown, and for a moment, I see a flicker of something ancient and knowing. And I wonder, not for the first time, what cosmic secrets lie behind those canine eyes. I've always been a bit of a loner, preferring the company of books and animals to that of people. It's been a few years since the events I'm about to recount took place, but they still haunt me to this day. I often find myself questioning whether what I experienced was real or just a product of my imagination, fueled by isolation and the eerie atmosphere of my new home. But let me start from the beginning, when I first moved into that old house on the outskirts of town with my cat, Sombra. It was a crisp autumn day when I pulled up to the driveway of my new home. The leaves were just beginning to turn, painting the landscape in hues of gold and crimson. The house stood before me, a looming Victorian structure with weathered wooden siding and intricate gingerbread trim. It was far larger than I needed, but the price had been too good to pass up, and I craved the solitude it promised. As I stepped out of the car, a cool breeze ruffled my hair, carrying with it the musty scent of decaying leaves. Sombra meowed impatiently from his carrier, eager to explore our new surroundings. I smiled, reaching in to scratch behind his ears. "We're home, buddy," I whispered, more to reassure myself than him. The interior of the house was a mix of faded grandeur and neglect. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light streaming through the grimy windows, and the floorboards creaked ominously under my feet. But I saw potential in every room, a fresh coat of paint here, some new curtains there, and it would be perfect. That first night, as I lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of the old house settling, I felt a sense of excitement mingled with trepidation. Sombra curled up at my feet, his warm presence a comfort in the darkness. Little did I know that this seemingly ordinary beginning would lead to a series of events that would challenge everything I thought I knew about reality and the nature of the creatures we call pets. The following weeks passed in a blur of unpacking boxes and settling into a new routine. I worked from home, writing articles for various online publications, which meant I spent most of my time in the house. Sombra adjusted quickly, claiming sunny spots by the windows and exploring every nook and cranny of our new abode. At first, everything seemed normal. The house had its quirks, pipes that rattled, floorboards that squeaked, and drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, but I chalked it up to the building's age. It wasn't until about a month after we moved in that I started noticing things. It began with subtle sounds in the night. I'm a light sleeper, and I often found myself jolting awake in the early hours of the morning, heart racing, certain I'd heard something. A whisper, perhaps, or the soft pad of footsteps in the hallway. But every time I investigated, I found nothing out of place, just Sombra curled up peacefully on his cat tree or watching me with those luminous amber eyes of his. As the days grew shorter and winter approached, the occurrences became more frequent. I'd wake to find objects moved from where I'd left them the night before. A book on the floor instead of the nightstand, my slippers in the hallway rather than by my bed. Once, I even found all the kitchen cabinet doors wide open, though I was certain I'd closed them before going to bed. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I was sleepwalking, or perhaps Sombra was getting into mischief at night. But a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me it was something else, something I couldn't quite explain. One particularly cold night in early December, I awoke to a sound that chilled me more than the draft seeping through the old windows. It was a whisper clear as day, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. And this time, I was certain it wasn't just the wind. My heart pounded as I lay frozen in bed, straining my ears to catch that whisper again. The silence stretched on, broken only by the mournful howl of the wind outside. Just as I'd convinced myself it was my imagination playing tricks, I heard it again. A soft, sibilant sound that seemed to form words I couldn't quite grasp. Summoning every ounce of courage, I slipped out of bed, my bare feet flinching at the cold wooden floor. I crept towards the door, hand trembling as I reached for the knob. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. With a deep breath, I yanked the door open. The hallway was empty, bathed in the pale moonlight filtering through the window at the end. But there, at the foot of my bed, sat Sombra. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, reflecting an eerie, greenish light I'd never seen before. He was staring intently at the corner of the room, his mouth moving in a silent mimicry of speech. "Sombra," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He turned to look at me, and for a moment, I swear I saw something ancient and knowing in those feline eyes. Then he blinked, and he was just my cat again, meowing softly as if asking why I was up so late. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of sleep and fear. "It's nothing, buddy," I murmured, more to convince myself than him. "Let's go back to sleep." But sleep eluded me that night, and many nights after. The whispers became a regular occurrence, always in the dead of night, always seeming to come from just around the corner or behind a closed door. And always, Sombra was there, watching, listening, his eyes reflecting that strange, otherworldly light. I began to dread the night, spending my days in a haze of exhaustion and growing paranoia. The once charming quirks of the old house now seemed sinister. Every creak was a footstep, every shadow a lurking presence. And through it all, Sombra remained my constant companion, alternating between moments of eerie alertness and the ordinary behavior of a common house cat. As winter deepened, the whispers were joined by a new, more tangible horror. It started one frosty morning when I stepped onto the porch to collect the mail. There, arranged in a perfect line, were 3 dead mice. Their tiny bodies were unmarked, as if they had simply laid down and died. My first thought was that Sombra had been hunting, but something about the precise arrangement unsettled me. Cats are natural hunters, yes, but this felt deliberate, organized, almost like an offering. I disposed of the mice, trying to shake off the unease that clung to me like a shroud. But the next morning, there were more. This time, 5 small birds, their feathers untouched, eyes glassy and staring. This macabre ritual continued day after day. Each morning I'd wake to find a new array of lifeless creatures on my porch. Mice, birds, even a rabbit once. Always arranged in neat rows or geometric patterns. Always untouched, as if they'd died of fright rather than injury. And always, Sombra was there, sitting nearby, watching me with those inscrutable amber eyes. He'd look up at me, then at the gifts, then back at me, as if gauging my reaction. When I'd clean up the grisly display, he'd follow me around the house, meowing insistently, almost as if he was disappointed that I wasn't appreciating his offerings. I tried keeping him inside at night, but it made no difference. The morning displays continued, and Sombra became agitated, yowling at the windows and clawing at the doors. Eventually, I relented, letting him out again, unable to bear his distress. As the days wore on, I found myself jumping at shadows, scrutinizing Sombra's every move. Was he just a cat, following his instincts? Or was there something more sinister at play? The line between reality and nightmare was beginning to blur, and I wasn't sure how much more I could take before I lost my grip on sanity entirely. The night that changed everything started like any other. I had finally managed to fall into a fitful sleep, lulled by the constant patter of rain against the windows. But sometime in the early hours, I was jolted awake by a sound that didn't belong, a heavy, dragging noise coming from downstairs. My heart leapt into my throat as I sat up, straining my ears. There it was again, a slow, laborious scraping, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor. It wasn't the house settling or the wind playing tricks. This was real, and it was happening right below me. With trembling hands, I reached for the baseball bat I'd started keeping by my bed. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I crept towards the stairs, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back, to hide under the covers and pretend this wasn't happening. As I descended, the dragging sound grew louder, punctuated by an occasional thump. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the basement door. Gathering every ounce of courage, I flicked on the hallway light. What I saw froze me in place. There was Sombra, his small feline form straining as he pulled something behind him. Something large and wrapped in what looked like an old sack. The impossibility of the scene before me made my head spin. How could my cat, barely 10 pounds soaking wet, be dragging something that size? Sombra paused in his efforts, turning to look at me. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw something in his gaze that chilled me to my core. It wasn't the look of a house pet caught in mischief. It was knowing, intelligent, almost human. And there, at the corners of his mouth, I could swear I saw the hint of a smile. The spell broke as Sombra resumed his task, dragging the sack towards the basement door with renewed vigor. I stood paralyzed, watching as my cat, or whatever he truly was, disappeared into the darkness below, the heavy object thumping down the stairs behind him. It wasn't until the door swung shut with a decisive click that I snapped out of my trance. I ran to the basement door, but found it locked from the inside. No matter how I pulled and twisted the knob, it wouldn't budge. I spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, jumping at every sound, waiting for dawn with a mixture of dread and desperate hope that the light of day would somehow make everything normal again. In the harsh light of morning, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. The basement door was unlocked, showing no signs of the previous night's events. When I finally mustered the courage to go down there, I found nothing out of the ordinary. No mysterious sack, no evidence of anything being dragged. Sombra was back to his usual self, purring and rubbing against my legs as if nothing had happened. But I couldn't shake the memory of that knowing look, that almost human smile. I threw myself into research, spending hours online reading about cat behavior, paranormal phenomena, and even obscure mythology. I found tales of shapeshifters and spirit animals, of cats as guardians of the underworld. But nothing quite matched what I was experiencing. I considered talking to someone, a friend, a therapist, anyone. But the fear of being labeled crazy kept me silent. Who would believe that my house cat was dragging corpse-sized sacks into a locked basement in the middle of the night? As the days passed, I found myself constantly on edge, watching Sombra's every move for signs of the otherworldly. Sometimes, I caught glimpses, a too intelligent gleam in his eye, a shadow that seemed larger than it should be, movements that weren't quite cat-like. But they were always fleeting, gone before I could be sure of what I'd seen. I was trapped in a maddening limbo, doubting my own sanity yet unable to deny the growing evidence that something was terribly wrong. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford, and the line between reality and nightmare grew increasingly blurred. Little did I know, the true horror was yet to come. The night of the revelation is seared into my memory, a nightmare made flesh. I had finally succumbed to exhaustion after days of fitful sleep, only to be jolted awake by an unnatural silence. The usual creaks and groans of the old house were absent, replaced by a stillness so profound it seemed to press against my eardrums. As I lay there, heart pounding, a shadow detached itself from the darkness at the foot of my bed. It was Sombra, but not as I'd ever seen him before. He stood upright on his hind legs, his form elongated and distorted, more man than cat. His amber eyes gleamed with an inner light, fixed unblinkingly on me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. I could only watch in silent horror as Sombra's head began to turn, slowly, impossibly, until it had rotated a full 180 degrees. His eyes, now completely black, never left mine. When he spoke, his voice was a rasp that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We've been waiting for you," he said, his feline mouth forming words no cat should be able to utter. "You're finally ready to see." With inhuman grace, he moved to the center of the room, his shadow stretching and twisting on the walls. As I watched, paralyzed, his form began to shift and grow. Fur receded, limbs elongated, until what stood before me was neither cat nor man, but something ancient and terrifying. The creature, for I could no longer think of it as Sombra, reached out a hand that was more claw than flesh. "Come," it said, its voice a symphony of whispers. "There's so much more to show you." In that moment, the spell of paralysis broke. I scrambled out of bed, nearly falling in my haste to put distance between myself and the thing that had been my pet. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers clumsy with fear. When light flooded the room, I found myself alone. Sombra, my ordinary black-furred cat, sat calmly on the windowsill, looking at me with what almost seemed like amusement in his amber eyes. I sank to the floor, my mind reeling. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination born of stress and sleep deprivation? But as I hugged my knees to my chest, trying to slow my racing heart, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A single long black claw on the floor where the creature had stood. The days following that nightmarish encounter passed in a haze of confusion and dread. Sombra behaved as if nothing had happened, purring contentedly and demanding food and attention as usual. But I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd seen, couldn't unsee the otherworldly being that had revealed itself in the dark of night. I found myself scrutinizing every move Sombra made, jumping at every unexpected sound. Sleep became an elusive luxury, my nights spent staring wide-eyed into the darkness, terrified of what might emerge from the shadows. During the day, I tried to convince myself it had all been a vivid nightmare. I researched sleep paralysis, night terrors, and every other possible explanation for what I'd experienced. But the claw I'd found, now hidden away in a locked drawer, was a constant, tangible reminder that something inexplicable had occurred. I considered getting rid of Sombra, finding him a new home, or even taking him to a shelter. But every time I steeled myself to do it, I'd look into those familiar amber eyes and falter. What if I was wrong? What if I was simply losing my mind? And a small, frightened part of me wondered, what would happen if I tried to separate myself from whatever Sombra truly was? So we continued our strange coexistence. By day, Sombra was the perfect feline companion, affectionate and playful. But as night fell, I'd catch glimpses of something else. A knowing look, a shadow that moved against the light, whispers that seemed to come from empty rooms. I lived in a state of constant vigilance, never quite sure if I was protecting myself from a genuine threat or slowly succumbing to paranoid delusions. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred beyond recognition, and I was trapped in a limbo of fear and uncertainty. As weeks turned to months, I began to wonder if this was to be my new normal, living with a creature that was both my beloved pet and something far more ancient and terrifying. As time passed, I found myself settling into a bizarre new normal. During the day, life with Sombra seemed almost ordinary. He would curl up in sunbeams, chase toys, and demand attention just like any other cat. I'd almost convinced myself that everything I'd experienced was a product of an overactive imagination or stress-induced hallucinations. But then night would fall, and with it came the reminders that nothing was truly normal anymore. I'd wake to find objects rearranged, or catch glimpses of somber shadow seeming far larger than it should be. The whispers never quite went away, always just on the edge of hearing, tantalizingly close to being understood. I developed coping mechanisms. I kept a journal, meticulously documenting every strange occurrence, trying to find patterns or explanations. I installed cameras throughout the house, though they never seemed to capture anything conclusive, just occasional static or unexplained blurs. My relationships suffered. How could I explain to friends or family why I was constantly exhausted, jumpy, and reluctant to leave my house? How could I tell them that I was living with something that might not be a cat at all, but an ancient, unknowable entity? So I withdrew, my world shrinking to the confines of the old house and its secrets. Sombra remained my constant companion, both a source of comfort and terror. There were moments of normalcy, even affection, interspersed with instances of bone-chilling fear when I'd catch him watching me with those too intelligent eyes. I lived in a state of perpetual alertness, never quite able to relax, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And through it all, one question haunted me. Was I the observer in this strange scenario, or was I the one being observed? Years have passed since that first terrifying night, and still, I find myself no closer to understanding the true nature of what transpired in that old house. Sombra remains with me, a living paradox, a creature of comfort and fear, familiarity and otherworldliness. There are days when I almost convince myself that it was all in my head, a bizarre delusion brought on by isolation and the creepy atmosphere of the house. But then Sombra will look at me in a certain way, or I'll wake to find impossible claw marks on my bedroom door, and the cycle of doubt and fear begins anew. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, to find a strange kind of balance in the unbalanced reality I inhabit. I no longer try to explain or understand. I simply accept that there are things in this world beyond human comprehension. Sombra has aged, as cats do, but there's still something timeless about him. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, I'll find him sitting at the window, staring out at something I can't see, and I'm reminded of that night when he stood before me as something ancient and terrifying. I often wonder if he'll outlive me, this creature that may or may not be a cat. Will he move on to another unsuspecting owner, bringing with him the whispers in the night and the blurring of reality? Or is our strange bond something unique, a once-in-a-lifetime crossing of paths between the mundane and the supernatural? As I write these words, Sombra sleeps peacefully at my feet, the picture of innocence. But I know that when night falls, the whispers will begin again, and I'll be reminded once more that some mysteries are never meant to be solved, only endured. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.